2004-18-14. I am watching a Netflix documentary called The Crip Camp. I am doing this as a part of a family project which I suggested. During the coronavirus pandemic, me and the rest of the family are having weekly Zoom meetings. And this was at the suggestion of Grandma Mimi, Meredith Cheston. I was the one who suggested, since conversation was awkward, stilted, stalling, that we watch movies and then discuss the movies for our Zoom sessions. I said I'd give my suggestions, and other people should too. And the first one to give the suggestion that Meredith accepted was Tara, my aunt, who is rather liberal, a sort of older Gen X, maybe young boomer hippie, who lives in San Francisco, who I love very much and who I respect and respected more before I became politically aware. Anyways, Crip Camp is a movie about a camp in the late 60s, early 70s for cripples. So this recording, I will be pausing and unpausing intermittently to give my thoughts on the matter, in part as a record to reflect on, but also in part as something to listen to before my Zoom call. The first thing of note is someone in the documentary who was a camp counselor said, "It's not them that needs to change. It's us that needs to change." So this conversation can get into topics of moral philosophy and even religion. So when there is a broken member of society, is it the responsibility of society to change to accommodate the broken member? This is a issue of ethics, of where we want to be as a society. Nothing in nature says that, yes, society needs to change, culture needs to change, everything needs to change for the broken. That is not true, at least in the Darwinian sense of the word. In the Darwinian sense, that is possibly damaging to the group as a whole. And I do believe that group evolution is a thing. I've read the evolutionary psychologists who said that group evolution is impossible. I do not buy that. That sounds like an in before for Kevin McDonald's arguments, which, you know, if you have group evolution, that kind of validates scientific racism to some sort of extent. And because we don't like the ethical taste of those conclusions, we reject the scientific reality of group evolution. Anyways, also it can get into religion, because I don't believe that the concept that society needs to change for the more pitiable, and I don't mean pitiable in a derogatory sense. Pity is not necessarily an emotion that is bad. You know, it is good to have pity for the broken, but to say that society should change for the pitiable is something I don't think would have come about without Christianity. The idea that the meek shall inherit the earth, that the lowest of you will become the highest, that is a Christian concept. Now, should I mention this in my Zoom call? I don't know. We'll see. Probably not, because in addition to my Xer or boomer, I think she's an Xer hippie of an aunt, I have, who is anti-Christian. I have a Christian apolitical aunt who will be on the call, and a boomer conservative mother who gets ruffles feathered at the thought of Christianity, but wants to completely absolve herself of ethical questions of should we or should we not, as a society, cater to the less able, to use a politically correct term. For context, for the rest of the recording, I am drinking gin and ginger beer. Between 3 to 6 drinks, depending on how you measure, as we go through this movie. So, should be fun. Gonna pause it now. Hopefully this stays paused. I'm not sure if this will stay paused after it sleeps or not, so I am going to save this and then do a test run. (2004-1814). It seems that these audio recordings are saving, so I will be continuing part 2 of my analysis of Crip Camp. Someone just said, everyone at camp has something going on with their bodies. And that's good. This camp to me is a beautiful thing, because crippled people, disabled people, mentally retarded people, people who have as fundamental to their identity the concept of being disabled in some way, deserve to be with others of their own kind, to experience that sort of group sync that only identity homogeneity can bring. I think disabilities, being mentally or physically retarded in some way, can bring a sense of greater symbiosis with your brothers and love, because that is your central identity. Not race, not class, when your very existence is defined by your disability, and that is a fundamental aspect of nature that has been opposed upon you by either circumstance or a mutation. That becomes your central component of identity. And I believe it is ethical for everyone to seek to find communion, comradeship, and brotherhood with people who share their own identity. A woman... Oh, I should pause when I... Okay, pause. Go. In the documentary, there's a woman in purple. I think she has cerebral palsy. She said something remarkably cogent. And I mean that in a way that most people wouldn't even think about things this way. She said, at home, people have a hierarchy by which they measure people with disabilities. She said at the top you have people with polio because they could sort of pass as normal. And at the bottom of this hierarchy you have people with cerebral palsy because they couldn't seem to be normal. If I'm getting the context right, this woman has cerebral palsy, and yet she is amazingly cerebral. She has a concept of social hierarchy and how social contexts can alter that hierarchy, which is pretty interesting. What about this camp would distinguish that hierarchy that they find so common in the normal world? I think because at that camp, the central identity is their disability. And even though there's gradations and variations within that disability, that hierarchy disappears because they're not constantly measuring their disability against their host society. Pause. A guy in the documentary was just talking about how back at home, and if sorry, I can't restart. A guy in the documentary was just talking about how in this camp, if you let me restart. A guy in this documentary was just talking about how back at home they were sometimes picked to play in games with the other kids, like baseball. But in the camp, you played, and everyone else had the same disability that you did, the same identity. And if you didn't hit the ball, you were out. The implication being, I think, that back at home, if you were playing a game with the other kids, it didn't matter if you hit the ball or not. Because normal people, not disabled people, were kind of, this is my projection at this point, probably were including these kids as a form of virtue signaling, which I make no moral judgments on. Virtue signaling is a way of indulging in your own sense of compassion, righteousness, and justice. So nothing necessarily inherently wrong with the instinct to virtue signal. But point is, when you're in a camp like this where everyone has a shared identity, you can struggle for greatness and find joy in victory. Whereas back home, you couldn't. Because I imagine if you're disabled, even people with the best of intentions, if they don't share your identity, them including you probably feels like they're just using you as a prop. Now, that's probably better than just being completely quarantined in a host society that does not share your identity and thus cannot identify with you. But nonetheless, it's a beautiful thing that this camp was able to do for these people. Pause. 2004-18-15. Continuation of the watching of Crip Camp. I paused and did a second file to talk to my mother about personal things revolving me, relationships, etc. Anyways, general commentary. These kids in this camp, these retards, are extremely wise and noble. It seems to me that if you are isolated a little bit from a host identity and you are forced to contrast your own identity with others, it it makes you a little more introspective. These people are talking about concepts, deep concepts like fear that their loved ones may have, and overprotectiveness, and how much of that fear might be related to their desire to seek some sort of social equilibrium. These are deep concepts that I don't think most people think about. So in a way, a disability, at least of the body and on the level of identity, can open you up spiritually. Pause. Unpause. We are getting to the point in the documentary where these disabled individuals are agitating against the host culture, the host society, people who do not share their identity as disabled individuals, and they are agitating for rights, for access, for ramps, etc., etc. I do not think this is wrong on their part. I think this is completely noble. This is an expression of will to power on their part. But I do not think it is inherently, on a platonic level, wrong for Nixon and other members of society to be hesitant to acquiesce to these demands. It is two identities clashing for interest and access. I don't know what. One can make arguments on either side of this argument in an abstract level. 2004-1817. This is, I guess, part 3 of my commentary on Crip Camp. I am at the part of the documentary where the disabled are moving away from society and integrating into the larger liberal narrative that is going on in the 60s and the early 70s. And there's this one cripple that is being wheeled out into a sort of transvestite live porn show, and this guy in a wheelchair is wheeled out, and this announcer is saying that this guy is who has no ability to really speak, is his dream is to have a dozen, what was the phrase? Thick-thighed, well-endowed boyfriends. So they're projecting an image which I think is fundamentally inorganic to whatever natural identity of a disabled person would be. I mean, the way they find purpose in the post-camp integration of the liberal society is to integrate with the transvestite porn industry. That seems like something where people are saying, if you want to maintain a sense of power and purpose in your host culture, you have to be antinomian and subversive fundamentally in your method of gaining power prominence in your host culture. It seems exploitative. There's nothing about this guy that is fundamental to the transvestite culture. Who came to this guy in a wheelchair with cerebral palsy and said, you know, you need to be participating in transvestite drag shows? I don't know. People who exploit minority identities for the purpose of subversion, I don't think it's right. There's something immoral about this. I still like this movie, though. It's just, you know, I don't think anything about this is fundamentally wholesome. Pause. Unpause. This is only 36 seconds. Well, 30 seconds after my last entry. But just watching this guy with CP, cerebral palsy, taking his clothes off and dancing around on stage, it's good for him, maybe, but the people cheering it on and the people who convinced this person that he needed to do this to feel some sense of pride, there's something demonically off on a fundamental moral and ethical sense to me. You know, you don't take a person who's vulnerable and say that you need to be I should just keep watching, because but my moral visceral reaction is this: there's something about this that is exploitative. There are people who are taking advantage of people with disabilities to advance their own political narrative of antinomian deconstruction on a social level. It feels wrong to me. I don't have any higher cerebral analysis of this. It just feels wrong on a grug level. Pause. Unpause. A counselor from the Crip Camp, who is also organizing these protests, these 504 protests, these sit-in protests, she just said, it was camp. Everything we learned at camp, we did there. I reject this. I absolutely do not see this. Everything I said before about the beauty and the purpose of what's going on with Crip Camp is completely an anathema to what is going on now. Because Crip Camp was about finding comradeship and brotherhood with people who shared your own worldview, your own identity, and then they come out into the main culture and they've subbed their own subculture within a host culture, and the counselors organize these people and say, you want to keep your community, then you have to do X, and you have to be politically active in the way that we say. I do not see that one is fundamentally connected to the other. I could see the argument on the other side, but I don't buy it as a given. I see a disconnect there that needs to be explored. The idea that politically active counselors, and not even them, but those who see a block that they can mobilize against the host culture, they are exploiting these people. I don't make any sort of judgment one way or another on the various bills that they're agitating for, but I do not say that it is fundamental to their experience at camp. I think one reality does not necessarily transfer to the other. And a compassionate society could focus on replicating the experiences they had at Crip Camp and not necessarily need to subvert the host culture into trying to integrate the experiences these people had at Crip Camp into the wider culture. Because not only is that bad for the host culture, but that dilutes the experience of Crip Camp. No matter how many, ramps you have in a building, you're not going to recreate that feeling of comradeship and shared identity that they had at Crip Camp. And I think that plays out in what we see today. There is no shortage of wheelchair accessible access to buildings, and that's all well fine and good, but you don't have that shared culture. When everyone is equal, no one is equal. To quote The Incredibles, when everyone is special, no one is special. You're denying these people their unique identity. Maybe. No, I think I'm right on that. Pause. Unpause. I'm not sure how to address this. I know how I'd address it within my own mind, but I'm not sure how I would address this to others. At this part in the documentary, the Crips, and I'm using the slang that was created by this documentary, the disabled, the crippled, the Crips, they are saying that it is unacceptable to have laws that are separate but equal. To have laws that say the disabled should have places for themselves, where they could completely have all the access they wanted, all the amenities they could ever need, all the care they could ever need. But essentially it would be a form of segregation. But let's not mince words here or delude ourselves. Everything that happened at the original Crip Camp was segregation. If you are disabled, you find the greatest purpose, beauty, and existential elevation of identity in a situation where you are essentially segregated, because you are with people who share your own identity, who share your own struggle. So, because separate but equal has its own moral connotations in modern day America, it's hard to discuss these things. But what was wrong with Crip Camp? what we saw in the first 20 minutes of this documentary. Everyone who saw the first 20 minutes of that documentary said this was a beautiful thing. This was a thing that affected these disabled individuals on a fundamental level. It was a good thing. And yet, after they left that camp, they said that everything that they experienced at that camp was fundamentally bad, because outsiders came in and saw these people as a coherent identity, as a potentially coherent political bloc, and said, we can use this. And they got, I'm sorry to say, subverted, in my opinion. Separate but equal was a thing that worked in the original Crip Camp. And now there's this idea that all of society, all however many millions of people we have in America, needs to integrate people with a disabled identity into our larger society, which doesn't necessarily do harm to the larger society itself, but I would argue it does harm to people who have disabilities, because it denies people with disabilities their identity. Pause. Unpause. Quoting a disability individual, we were more scared of Judy Harmond than we were ever scared of the FBI or getting arrested. And these were people who were barring entries and exits of the President of the United States. So, people with disabilities were used as tools by Judy Harmond to agitate against the President, and the disabled individuals, as admitted in this very documentary, were afraid of Judy. I don't know. I maybe need to do some research into Judy, but someone who makes disabled people afraid of her in order to use those disabled people as political tools, fuck Judy. Unpause. I am 1 hour and 31 minutes into the documentary. It's almost finished. There is a sound engineer who is saying that prior to Act 5, his struggle denied a part of who he was. No. I mean, everything I've seen about this guy's identity and the experience that these people had at Crip Camp says that the struggle affirmed their identity. The struggle defines their identity. It doesn't dilute the identity. Quite the inverse. The idea that the lack of struggle affirms your identity is not true. Struggle is central to identity. And by saying that the world needs to change to dissipate struggle eliminates identity. Identity is a thing that segregates you from the rest of the universe. So it integrates you into the rest of the universe, but that doesn't... Integrating yourself into the rest of the universe denies who you are. It extinguishes identity. Pause. Unpause. Quote, "You can change a law, but until you change society's attitudes, that law will not mean much." End quote. That's true. No more commentary at this point. Pause. Unpause. So, I have completed my watch of Netflix Crip Camp, a disability revolution. And I'm glad I watched it. I have mixed feelings because the actual documentary was not about the Crip Camp. The Crip Camp was 25 to maybe 33% of the actual documentary. The rest of it was about, political activism. And the first 25 to a third of the movie was great for reasons I already articulated when I was less lubricated by alcohol. But the rest of the movie was strange. It was a mix between feeling that this Judy human, or human, some people I think called her Hammond, but it's Judith Human, Heumann. I feel like she was exploiting the community of which she was a part of in order to agitate for her own political views. I don't know. I felt some of the things that she was doing was pretty immoral. A lot of the characters were saying, "Oh, we're afraid of her, and we're afraid of disappointing her." But at the same time, I mean, it's good that we have ramps, for wheelchairs. There's nothing wrong with that. I feel like one should investigate this Judy Human character and what her motives were. I feel like outside forces were using these people for their own political ends that was not necessarily to the benefit of the disabled. And I feel like the miracle that was Crip Camp was used as just a launching pad for political agitation. And the message that should have been taken from Crip was completely ignored. They said, "Oh, this system that says that we should have a unique, coherent identity should be abolished, and the disabled should be completely integrated into society, and society needs to change in order for that integration to happen." I think that's wrong. Not necessarily because it's wrong that society should change, but it's wrong to deny the disabled their own unique identity and their ability to explore that identity within a homogenous subculture. So, I don't know. It's an interesting thought experiment. and there's a lot here to explore in the realm of political and ethical philosophy. Um, yeah, I'd encourage people to look into the characters of this documentary more, and also question the fundamental implications that support the latter 75% of this documentary, because I just don't buy it. I don't see that what they learned at Crip Camp necessitated everything that came afterwards. Far from it. I think everything that came afterwards undermined the miracle that was Crip Camp. And I guess that's my review of the documentary. Ta-da!